Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and well, it's that time. Now, so far in this series, I've been covering the history and the various editions of Dungeons & Dragons, from a layman's point of view, admittedly, as well as offering a basic overview of the systems themselves and my opinion of their impact. And now it's finally time to address 4th edition. As of this recording, it is now, judging from past edition release dates, fairly far into the product cycle of 5th edition. I believe far enough for opinions, good or ill, to have cooled a bit on the prior edition. And yet, and I'm going to put this right up front, 4th edition is still my least favorite edition of Dungeons & Dragons, all the way back to the 70s. That having been said, I don't believe it is utter garbage. There are some very noteworthy things within the system, and I do intend to give it a fair shake. But I cannot deny that even looking back at 4th edition was a bit of a chore for me. Everything has its context, however. When I covered 3rd edition, I spoke about the eruption of third-party materials due to the open gaming license. That resulted in a large number of studios rising that would eventually go on to produce some very good material, and indeed some modern classics. However, this didn't necessarily translate into massive sales of the core books. 3rd edition sales were healthy, but increasing competition from non-tabletop hobbies, especially in the computer gaming and the burgeoning genre of massively multiplayer online role-playing games, began to impact the hobby. Not necessarily in terms of just existing customers, but also providing an alternative social outlet for potential customers. As the middle of the decade peaked, work began on 4th edition. It was meant to simplify a system that had become increasingly simulationist. It was meant to be intuitive enough for new players to grasp easily. It was meant to eliminate imbalances in classes that some felt had plagued the game since its very inception. It was meant to borrow concepts from the most popular MMORPGs at the time to give everyone in the group something to do in combat. 4th edition was also supposed to launch with a full suite of online support, including character builders and visualizers. It was supposed to have an online compendium that would allow rules to be updated and pushed out over the internet in much the way that patches for CRPGs and MMORPGs were beginning to do at the time. On the business side, Wizards of the Coast was hoping that 4th edition would generate additional revenue by subscriptions to D&D Insider, to use the aforementioned online support. They were hoping to release major rules expansions that would then sell as well, if not better, than the core books, in the form of not only additional players' handbooks and dungeon masters' guides that would offer more classes, races, and rules, but also the already proven method of releasing additional monster manual volumes and additional class-based features. They also included a new license, the GSL, for third-party developers to produce 4th edition content that some believed, if accepted, would revoke the irrevocable and prevent them from using the old OGL. Upon reviewing it, I don't believe that was the case, but the GSL was far more stringent than the OGL, to the point where there were very few third-party publishers willing to use it to a great degree, at least compared to simply contributing to the old OGL and continuing on with what they were doing. One might suspect that Wizards of the Coast was hoping to put the genie back into the bottle, as it were. So think a bit about what I just said. 4th edition was meant to do a lot of things. It was supposed to do some things. Wizards of the Coast were hoping to do some things. 4th edition, I believe, is an object lesson in the law of unintended consequences. The gulf between their intentions, good or bad, and what actually happened was immense. Now we can follow the timeline of 4th edition and identify where intentions and reality diverged several times. And we can start at the very launch itself. It was launched in June of 2008, with all 3 of the core books coming out at the same time: the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual, as prior editions had. Although there was much hype leading up to the release, there was actually relatively little compared to prior releases in the way of concrete examples of what to expect within it. However, all three did sell well, and spoke of the online support to be offered through D&D Insider. Support which wasn't actually present to a large degree on release. Indeed, it took months for the online support to manifest at even a semi-reasonable level. This delay effectively put a serious damper on the viability of the online platform itself. Since the intent was to charge a subscription fee for the online support, and the subscription fee couldn't really be justified without the actual programs in place, not only did D&D Insider miss out on that initial surge of hype, but by the time it was ready for prime time, so to speak, the D&D 4th edition itself had been out for some time, with all of its attendant baggage now becoming clear to everybody who was playing it. 4th edition was designed to welcome new players, and the marketing focus was to try to capture people outside of the usual gaming circles, and it actually did remarkably well at that. Unfortunately, all prior editions had relied heavily on people who were already gamers to spread the word about the new editions. By virtually ignoring that existing segment of the market, simply presuming that large swaths of people would simply convert just because of the new edition being, well, new, let's just say that certain mistakes were made. Especially since a lot of changes were made to the underlying system, which I'll get into later in the review when I talk about the specifics. This served to sharply divide an existing customer base. When you have a fractured customer base, it opens an opportunity in the market. There are ways to shore up support and kind of close that opportunity, especially if you have a healthy crop of third-party publishers willing to put out minor fixes and supplements to make your system more palatable to your prior customer base. Or, you can push out a new, more restrictive license that intentionally tries to rein in third-party production and make it very unattractive for anyone who wants to actually make money to support your system. Not the wisest course of action, but it is a course of action. And thus, Paizo, which had been publishing Dungeon and Dragon magazines for Wizards of the Coast, and had an entire stable of content producers who were familiar with releasing products under the SRD, let their D&D licenses lapse, and instead put out their own role-playing game a year later, called Pathfinder Role-Playing Game. It used a modified and streamlined version of the D&D 3.5 rules under the SRD, and entered direct competition with Dungeons & Dragons, and is really worthy of an entire video series of itself. Now, sales figures for RPGs are notoriously hard to pin down, especially from this particular era, but from what sources that I can gather, over the course of its various releases, Pathfinder gradually overtook D&D 4th edition. Sales of 4th edition don't seem to have initially flagged, but rather they didn't grow as fast as they could have, and by the late product line, interest in 4th edition sank even further. This was problematic not only on its face, but also because a fair amount of the 4th edition design centered around releasing core books as well as splat books, with the release of Players' Handbooks 2 and 3, Dungeon Master's Guide 2, and Monster Manuals 2 and 3, as well as the various power supplements that focused on class groups such as Martial Power, Arcane Power, as well as the Adventurer's Vault series. The Essentials series might have been seen by some as an attempt to salvage the system, by finally trying to appeal to old-school D&D players. Whether that was in the intention of that system or not, I personally found it more approachable and more in the spirit of classic D&D than pretty much all of the 4th edition releases that happened prior. It further streamlined 4th edition, but it did bring a lot of the classes and combat effects more in line with what D&D felt like in prior editions, at least thematically. With the first of the Essentials line releasing in late 2010, it may have been too radical a midline shift for some, and perhaps too little too late, because development of 5th edition was announced in early 2012, with the final 4th edition products coming down the pipeline just a few months later. From June of 2008's release of the core books to May of 2012's release of the Dungeon Survival Handbook, 4th edition took a mere 4 years to complete its run. And while 5th edition wouldn't be released until 2014, support for 4th edition ground to a virtual halt. This is, by far, the shortest period of major revision of Dungeons & Dragons had been in production since the Holmes era. While 4th edition did make a profit, the missteps in design and marketing, as well as the handling of the existing community, all contributed not only to knocking D&D off of the top of the pile of the RPG systems, but arguably went a long way towards seriously strengthening a major competitor. Moreover, it brought to light fundamental differences in game design and marketing philosophy that I believe still have not been fully processed to this day, despite the subsequent success of 5th edition. But that's a topic for another video. For now, let's actually take a look at 4th edition's system. Its concepts diverge radically from almost all prior versions of Dungeons & Dragons, so how I will approach this is to address only the core 3 books, the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual, and then I'll take a look at some of the changes made for the Essential series. Finally, I'll give my thoughts on the system itself overall. In case you haven't caught on by now, once again, the core rules were initially presented in 3 classic books, the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. However, this time around, the Dungeon Tiles line of modular dungeon tiles to create battle maps was listed as a core product. While these had been introduced with an earlier edition, the fact that they were moved to the core line of products is indicative of how closely battle maps and miniatures, or at the very least tokens, figure into the 4th edition rules. Now, I won't be covering dungeon tiles here, but suffice to say that I will be remarking on the need for miniatures and tokens in the appropriate spots. Immediately, the difference in design is clear, as the covers are done in a slick style with full color illustrations. The branding was fairly consistent throughout the 4th edition line, with what seemed like an attempt for a brighter, more approachable, and yet more uniform look than the prior editions. Interestingly enough, the artist, Wayne Reynolds, who did the front cover artwork for the first 3 core books, also did the later cover art for the later Pathfinder RPG. And although both lines had their own art direction, the style is very similar, and verging into something a number of people call dungeon punk. We'll start with the Player's Handbook. Clocking in at 320 pages, it starts with an introduction to role-playing games in general, the history of Dungeons & Dragons to that point, and then covers the usual basics of terminology, dice, and what's important to the game. This is followed by an explanation of the D20 core mechanic, which is inherited from the 3rd edition, being just a D20 plus modifiers versus a target number. Chapter 1 finishes with a plug for D&D Insider. Chapter 2 covers making characters, and the first inklings of differences in edition really show here, not only in the included races and classes, but the addition of character roles. Character roles are semi-formal niches that a character can fill, which directly correspond to classic roles in an MMORPG party. The initial character races include Dragonborn, Dwarves, Eladrin, Elves, Half-Elves, Halflings, Humans, and Tieflings, while classes include Cleric, Fighter, Paladin, Ranger, Rogue, Warlock, Warlord, and Wizard. Some of the classic races and classes would be added in later player handbooks. Ability scores are much as they were in the 3rd edition, with the classic 6 rated in a linear bonus style. The saving throws of Fortitude, Reflex, and Will from the 3rd edition are simply rendered as defenses, along with armor class, against which rolls must be made by opponents rather than rolls to save made by the players. In a bid to be more balanced, and this is a key term throughout all of the 4th edition, balance, each of the defenses is affected by the highest of not 1, but 2 ability scores. Further, in terms of generating these scores, a standard array is considered the default method of determining them, followed by point buy, and then simply rolling for ability scores is relegated to last place. Even the write-up on rolling scores seems to discourage doing so. After all, it's all about fairness. Alignments have been simplified as well. Rather than relatively easy to understand 2-axis alignment systems, there are 5 independent alignments: good, lawful good, evil, chaotic evil, and unaligned. Supposedly it was done in a bid to be easier to explain and somehow less exploitable. Not sure I buy that. Default deities are also included, much like in 3rd edition, although there are a broader mix rather than simply being the default Greyhawk deities. The chapter then goes on to give guidance for more role-playing oriented elements of background, appearance, and the like. Explanations for making various types of checks follows, and then an explanation of gaining levels, which shares some elements from the prior 3rd edition, although it has been greatly expanded. The level cap is now 30th level, with play divided into 3 tiers: Heroic, Paragon, and Epic. Characters may gain class features, ability score increases at certain levels, feats at certain levels, and then powers, up to a set number that is uniform from class to class. The powers are really kind of the crux of the difference between 4th edition and prior versions, but also a source of a fair amount of complaints about the change. The power system is based largely on MMORPG and general CRPG ideas of the time, which often have a system of triggerable abilities that do one thing and then refresh over time. Since D&D is a turn-based game rather than a real-time game, effectively having a refresh timer has to follow into the general structure of that game. Thus, powers themselves come in 4 versions. At-will attack powers can be used basically at will, once a round, and are generally considered a basic augment to an attack or a replacement to an attack. Indeed, the existence of these at-will powers often supplanted the existence of just normal attacks. Encounter powers can be used once per encounter, basically refreshing after the encounter is over, while daily powers are usable only once a day, refreshing after a long rest. Finally, utility powers are miscellaneous powers that usually fall into one of the other 3 categories. Chapter 3 covers character races, and races have actually been standardized in 4th edition. All races have an info block leading off that tell their physical parameters, their ability score adjustments, size, speed, what sort of vision they have, their languages, their skill bonuses, and their racial abilities. Occasionally, this may include a power that can be used the same way as any class power. For instance, the Dragonborn's breath weapon. The change in the basic races offered in the first player's handbook seems a stark departure from the earlier versions of D&D, neglecting the presence of gnomes or half-orcs, and instead adding the Dragonborn and splitting the High Elves into Eladrin, while Elves simply refers to what used to be Wood Elves of prior editions. They also standardized tieflings into a sort of devilish horned creature that quite frankly resembles a certain race from the expansion for a major MMORPG popular at that time. Chapter 3 covers character classes, which now have 3 tiers of play. Each class chooses a Paragon path at 11th level, and then an Epic Destiny at 21st. Aside from that, each class lists a number of powers at each appropriate level that follow a format that is described through the first several pages of Chapter 3. It reads a lot like a video game instruction manual, as each power relies heavily on a set of very standardized terms and keywords to determine its abilities. Classes themselves also have a role, equal to one of the defined MMORPG-inspired roles, a power source which honestly rarely enters into play, armor and weapon proficiencies, a defensive bonus to one of the 4 main defenses, information on hit points and healing surges, trained skills that the class automatically knows, and then build options. Many classes start with a list of basic class features as well. In 4th edition, each class attains a set number of hit points per level, in the interest, again, of balance. Healing surges are used during short rests and during other certain abilities to allow a character to heal themselves, and I'll maybe mention more about that later, but in general it makes characters able to heal themselves without necessarily having a full-time dedicated healer in the group. The build options aren't required, but instead offer suggested builds like you'd see in, you guessed it, a computer RPG. The Paragon paths basically end up being specializations, as do the later Epic Destinies. Multiclassing has been taken almost completely out, although a minor version may be undertaken by taking feats that give abilities of other classes. The change in the number of classes is another element where 4th edition departed in terms of flavor from prior editions. The lack of Barbarian, Monk, Bard, and Sorcerer was addressed in later players' handbooks, while the addition of Warlock and Warlord to the main was more meant to fill in perceived gaps in the role system. As each of the classes includes many pages of abilities, the class section effectively ends up being about half of the book, pretty much combining the old spell list of earlier editions with the class section. Chapter 5 then describes skills and is much shorter by comparison. The number of skills has been pared down dramatically from 3rd edition, and gone are any talk of ranks. A character is simply either trained in a skill and thus has a slightly higher total, or is not trained. Each skill has a set number of things that the skill can be used for, at least out of the box, although a particular DM or even later books may add more. Chapter 6 includes feats, which greatly resemble the system used in 3rd edition, except that characters get a lot more of them this time around. Further, the feats themselves seem very watered down and simplified, and the vast majority of them simply seem to be variations of minor bonuses to one particular attack type or another. Again, I guess this is meant as a nod to fairness and balance, as well as a way to rein in certain synergistic effects that complex feats tend to make. Feats are divided by tiers, with each tier having increasingly fewer feats, although characters of those tiers could still have access to prior tiers of feats to select from. The equipment chapter includes a new money system, which expands 3rd edition's copper, silver, gold, and platinum economy with astral diamonds, making it possible to realistically envision a character carrying around absolutely obscene amounts of wealth. Armor and weapons have both been simplified, although they now include something called a proficiency bonus, which is a variable accuracy bonus that is given only when a character is proficient with that particular weapon's use. Of note is that the magic items section has been put directly into the player's handbook. Although it says that they're not necessarily, freely available in random magic shops, it basically formalizes it despite saying that. In fact, it's best exemplified in the D&D movie Book of Vile Darkness, where the hero goes into a store to buy armor, is asked whether he wants it in heroic or paragon tier, and then responds, "Why paragon, of course," as if he was actually offended by the use of an in-game tier. Although a GM can, of course, change this, the simple fact of the matter is that 4th edition is very much balanced with the idea that characters can simply acquire magic items that they want in a particular price range, either directly or through an in-game method of disenchanting and then re-enchanting items. This actually replaces the 3rd edition crafting feats and takes those out of any class's range. The only real saving grace is that selling or disenchanting an item and then using it to either buy or re-enchant another item results in a value reduction to simply 20% of the original, which can make items found during an adventure a little bit more attractive. A lot of the magic items have very simplified abilities, simply offering another power that can be used just like the character's class powers, plus a minor bonus one way or another. The next chapter covers adventuring, including what a player can expect during adventures in terms of quests, encounters, and rewards. This is where a number of additional 4th edition systems are described, including the concept of milestones, which grant benefits for finishing 2 or more encounters at once without stopping for an extended rest, action points, which can allow for an additional action or use of a particular ability, and then the 2 new rest mechanics. Short rests allow for the identification of magic items, renewal of encounter powers, and the use of healing surges to heal damage, and they only take 5 minutes. Extended rests take the full 6 hours, and restore daily powers, action points, all hit points lost, as well as all healing surges. Yes, this means that as soon as a character completes a long rest, no matter how beat up or maimed and close to death they are, they'll instantly heal to full overnight. Almost like you would in a CRPG. Chapter 9 includes the combat rules, which are actually surprisingly short, although that's mostly due to the entire rest of the book setting up what a character can do. Turn order and action types have been streamlined further from 3rd edition, involving the standard, move, and minor action types. There's rules for attacks, including basic attacks, and then the various conditions that can be inflicted, which are formalized even further than 3rd edition, resulting in a very status effect type feel. There are, of course, the usual rules on cover and movement and so forth, which are now almost all tile-based, and combined with the need to know ranges and area of effects for powers, pretty much require the use of a battle grid tokens for a fight of any complexity. Actions in combat, even beyond the basic attacks and powers, have been formalized as well, and read very much like miniature powers. Chapter 10 covers rituals, which are effectively what happened to the non-combat utility spells, since now all spells simply end up being powers. Fortunately, rituals can be used pretty much whenever, so long as the caster can actually afford to cast it, and each is considered associated with a key skill, so even non-spellcasters can theoretically use them if they take the appropriate feat. And that pretty much wraps up the player's handbook. The Dungeon Master's Guide is nearly 100 pages shorter than the player's handbook, as most of the usual Dungeon Master's information has actually been moved to the player's side. It starts with a chapter on how to be a GM, which includes lists of equipment suggested, and then goes on to how to identify and deal with certain troublesome player types, neatly categorized into different player stereotypes. The DM styles are then covered, including the kinds of games that you can run themselves, along with the pros and cons of each type and style. Finally, there's a section on establishing certain table rules, which can be used to avoid distractions. Chapter 2 talks about running the game, which basically covers the tips and tricks that have become pretty standard for Dungeon Masters, although there is a bit of a focus on delegating certain elements to the players themselves. There are tips on developing certain moods, pacing and representing items at the table, as well as handling certain skills, disseminating information, and then dealing with common problems that crop up. It's actually a pretty helpful chapter all in all. The chapter closes with a selection on teaching the game, which, although it seems a little bit sparse, I guess 4th edition is supposed to be easier to teach in general, so there is that. Chapter 3 deals with combat encounters, which is really the core of 4th edition, so it is relatively important to read. It covers on how to deal with combat, not from a rules perspective, but from the process of running it and then concluding it. There are a few additional combat rules to cover rare circumstances, sample diseases which utilize, what else, a power style of system, and then poisons which again seem simply like leveled powers. The next chapter covers actually building encounters, and is at once one of the most useful chapters while exemplifying certain things about 4th edition that I found very irritating. It discusses the roles not only of players but of monsters, which have similar although not identical roles to players. Because of course monsters, have to fill in their own roles in their own enemy parties as well. It does give a set of rules to mathematically balance encounters based on experience point budgets, including a series of tactical encounter templates that you can then plug other monsters into. There is a similar system for designing the encounter terrain, then rules for dealing with objects and dungeon dressing, and finally general wilderness and fantastic terrain rules. Chapter 5 covers non-combat encounters, and starts off with the concept of skill challenges. This basically attempted to formalize skill use into an experience-granting series of skill checks. I'll get into my experiences with it later, but I don't think it really hit the point. Puzzles and then traps and hazards also kind of are set up in a similar way, although traps and hazards themselves seem to be almost designed like monsters, including a role in the same manner that monsters have. Chapter 6 handles adventures and includes basic guidelines for setting them up and writing them, which can be useful, some existing structures that one can use, a segment on quests and quest design, and then guidelines on designing a good mix of encounters for the course of an adventure. Various adventure settings are then discussed before more information is given on fleshing out and mapping particular settings. The chapter concludes by touching on role-playing the various sorts of characters that the group may meet in an adventure. It's actually one of the more useful chapters in here. The next chapter handles rewards and covers experience, which is pretty self-explanatory, handling milestones and the subsequent action point reward for reaching them, and finally ending in treasure. Now, the treasure system in 4th edition uses something called treasure parcels, which seems vaguely based on the character wealth by level from 3rd edition, but further formalizes it into separate packages of items and cash, suitable for parties of various sizes. I'm not a huge fan of this system, not at all, and I complained a lot about it when I was running 4th edition myself, but honestly, on retrospect, it's not too bad, all things considered, and I can see where it'll be helpful for a beginning DM that has never run the game before. Chapter 8 covers campaigns and begins with simply how to design them, and if necessary, where to get ideas for them. Basic campaign theme ideas are given, as well as campaign types. There are rules for starting at higher levels, which is always a useful thing, especially in 4th edition, since everything is pretty much balanced, so you can just swap characters out, as well as guidelines for keeping tracks of things in a campaign through various tiers of play. Chapter 9 goes into world creation, from magic level to settlement to wilderness and the alternate planes, and then talks about the basic changed cosmology of the default setting. Some sample gods and artifacts are also given for inspiration. Chapter 10 is the last functional rules chapter, and covers various DM tools, including rules for customizing monsters, sample templates, creating new monsters, and creating NPCs. There's some sample house rules as well as a brief rule for generating random dungeons and random encounters, although I never actually got a chance to use those particular rules. Chapter 11 gives a sample town, in this case Fallcrest, which actually can be used to launch adventures for the published 4th edition generic module series. I used it that way. It also includes an overview of the Nentir Vale as a whole, which is the default 4th edition setting, an example dungeon called Kobold Hall. I ran my group through that sample dungeon, and actually found it to be quite decent at getting the basics of the game down for new DMs and new players. The Monster Manual is the final of the core books, and as usual is simply a large collection of monsters. In this case, each monster has its own card detailing role, level experience, abilities, and powers, and then a description of basic lore and tactics, as well as some sample encounter groups. Several of the monsters simply have different monsters set at different power levels. It should be noted, however, that several iconic monsters saw drastic changes in how they were handled via lore in this edition, including the angels, elementals, and giants. Now, later core books would include much of the same ideas, with the player's handbooks covering what the first one did, but expanding the selection of races and classes and powers, the monster manuals simply expanding the selection of monsters, and the various power books simply offering a lot of new powers for particular classes. Various plane and setting books simply offered more information on that particular splat book's focus that's actually been a part of D&D since way back when. It should be noted, however, that later books sometimes actually reprinted updates or various rules and powers, and sometimes made drastic changes to them that basically functioned as kind of like a patch for people who didn't have D&D Insider. They also drastically changed, or actually I'm not sure how drastic it was, but I know they changed the guidelines on monster creation a lot with the release of Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide 2, which ended up requiring a kind of rebalance for people that were used to making their own monsters. Now, the Essential series, by contrast, drastically reworked individual builds for classes and their abilities to more resemble the prior edition formats. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the Essential series is a throwback to the basic D&D series from way back when. The basic classes and races of yore were covered with a few additions, and split into 2 basic books, each of which included the rules, at least enough to play, all in a paperback format, kind of like a miniature player's handbook. The rules compendium offered a more thorough treatment of the game's rules in general, and the Essentials Monster Vault functioned not only as a compact monster manual, but also included necessary tokens for battle maps. So I already mentioned the marketing issues, the online support issues, the change in the third-party license, all as contributing factors as to what happened with 4th edition, but that can't explain why the system itself is so disliked by a fairly large proportion of players. Now, if you ask 6 people who don't like 4th edition why they don't, you're likely to get 6 different answers. But over time, some of them really kind of came to the top as clear factors. One of the major complaints is that it feels video gamey, and I have to admit that is a valid point. Since I cover both tabletop and video games, I think I know this. Now, honestly, however, not that much in terms of mechanics were actually taken from computer RPGs and MMORPGs, but what rules were inspired are actually pretty fundamental to the 4th edition system, and mark sharp departures from the way that prior editions worked. Effectively, the system didn't feel like D&D, except in the most basic of ways. Another major complaint is that it takes the focus off of role-playing and puts it onto combat. This is not new to 4th edition, and honestly one of the premises and reasonings for reducing focus of the rules on things like skills and crafting was supposedly to give the GM more flexibility in that regard. But the problem is that when you've got skill rules that are still there, and you've got combat powers that are still there, and they are as formalized and as set in stone as they are, it can give the impression of limiting options rather than opening up the undefined ones. When you give a player what is effectively a menu of things that a character can perform, they'll tend not to think beyond that menu. This actually combines with the prior complaint of video game elements to produce a certain feel. Video games, by their nature, limit player actions to what the game engine can handle. If you want to get away from the video game analogy, board games also limit player actions to what's covered by the rules, and the heavy use of battle maps and miniatures necessary for 4th edition can put a player in that same mindset of only looking at what's specifically enumerated for their characters to perform. Another major issue is the change in fundamental aspects of the game's lore. From alignment changes to basic race changes to a change in the way that the planes themselves work, a lot of the lore that had built up since the game's inception over the decades was, in one fell swoop, either altered moderately or completely. This effectively made it feel as if the game were set in an entirely different universe, which is not only a stark change in and of itself, but furthered the feel of it simply not feeling like D&D. A more subtle change was in the philosophy of the game itself. Some of the aforementioned changes were done in the name of balance and fairness, and this runs throughout the core of the game, from relying on point buys, to certain builds, to reducing certain classes merely to interchangeable roles, to reducing feats and magic items to simply bundles of minor bonuses and abilities. The intent may have been to foster cooperation by making sure everyone was balanced against everybody else, but the unintended consequences can result in a certain detachment and depersonalization of the characters. Instead of feeling like a unique representation of a persona, it can be seen as, and indeed is referenced in the text as, simply builds, simply interchangeable groups of ability points, pre-selected powers, and gear that can be duplicated, and often were, by other players of similar level playing similar content. Now, while this doesn't explicitly reduce player investment in personalization, it does end up making it feel a lot like simply rolling up a new character in an MMORPG. So between the changes to the lore, the changes to the rules, the changes to the very races and classes themselves, the changes to the alignment system, the change to the fundamental philosophy governing the game, it should be no wonder that 4th edition felt like something other than Dungeons & Dragons. That having been said, the combat system itself is not bad. It actually works very well for a tabletop miniature skirmish game. Indeed, slightly simplified versions have been used for D&D board games, and work well in that context. I would go so far to say that 4th edition works very well as a purely dungeon-crawling, combat-focused system. But it doesn't feel like D&D. Not mechanically, not with the lore, not on even how it approaches adventuring. And that's very important, because it was sold and it was marketed as Dungeons & Dragons. It has been said by more thoughtful writers than I that if 4th edition had been marketed as a new system that wasn't D&D, it would have been better received, at least critically. I'm not sure if I'm completely on board with that, because the D&D name did guarantee a certain number of sales, and that did indeed make it a success. But by selling something as D&D that didn't feel like D&D, it didn't play like D&D, Wizards of the Coast expended some goodwill with their existing player base. Not entirely sure that's actually bothered them outwardly, ever, but it is an important lesson to understand going forward, and it's actually one which I'm not entirely convinced they've learned. My own experiences with 4th edition were fraught with issues that tinge my own memories of it. I found the prep time required to make encounters, even with the budget system, to be untenable. Even when the prep work was already done, game sessions would often only be able to get through one combat encounter. There was a problem with keeping track of all the short-term debuffs my group would tend to stack on things, although that may have been more of a problem with my players' preferred builds. The skill challenge system never really seemed to work out for me, as it usually ended up just being 1 or 2 characters that had even remotely relevant skills, so even the limited amount of cooperation I saw for such challenges in other editions fell by the wayside. Finally, the predictability and quick recovery of hit points, combined with the power system, made even my group of players treat it like a video game, complete with MMORPG-style tactics that don't really make sense for most narratives. And most of my groups are ones that regularly and have for years played very old-school style games, including retro clones and just older editions that tend to discourage that sort of play. And to be brutally honest, if I wanted to play a computer game, I've got an entire hard drive full of them to play with the exact same people, except letting the computer do all the work with status tracking and roles and so forth. Now, that having been said, I still from time to time think of throwing a purely hack-and-slash style campaign together using 4th edition, since the combat system did end up making for more dynamic combats, at least in terms of movement and positioning, so I'll give it credit there. I will also say this: 4th edition was important, whatever you may think of the system itself. It did open up role-playing games to a new audience, even if it's not entirely sure how much of that audience was retained. Without 4th edition, there probably wouldn't have been Pathfinder, and if 4th edition had been designed a little bit differently, a little bit more D&D, then there probably wouldn't have been the impetus to put 5th edition out in the form that it finally took, which actually brought a lot of people back from the very old editions to current role-playing. And on that note, this retrospective will draw to a close for now. Now, I may cover 5th edition in the future, but as it is, as of this recording, it's still an active product. So it's a bit early to look at its place in history, since it's still making its place in history. I do hope that you've enjoyed this series thus far. This has been the RPG Crawler. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you've got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. If you're feeling particularly generous and would like to support the channel, I do have a Patreon at patreon.com/rpgcrawler. Until next time, take care and goodbye.